Thank you so much, Emran. So nice to see all of you. And I'm super happy to see several familiar faces as well from other collaborations. So my name is Klara. I'm very excited to give you a brief presentation today of our educational method that is called Courage. I'm a little bit nervous though, because normally this lecture is around 2 hours and I spent quite some time in kind of putting it together into half an hour presentation. So please bear with me and I'll be very happy to answer questions and continue the discussions afterwards. I will also be very happy to share my email address so we can continue the discussions in other digital meetings and so on as well. With that said, I will share my presentation. So the method that I think you also got kind of an introduction of the Expo Foundation. So I won't waste too much time in talking about the foundation. But very shortly, we were founded in 1995, and we are working to kind of spread information how to combat racist ideas. And like the last 3 or 4 years, we have been working very specifically on a project on how to respond to racist ideas, even like no matter if you're a politician in a political debate or in our daily lives. And this is something that we have developed into a method that is called Courage. And before I continue, I also want to highlight that together with support from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, we got to kind of summarize this method in a toolkit. And this toolkit is translated to English, Swedish, German, French, Finnish, and Norwegian. And it's available for download on their webpage. So there we go through more in depth the different principles that I will present for you today. But very like as an overview, in this method, we have kind of pointed out 5 key principles that I would like to run through with you today very briefly. And I would say that the first key principle that we emphasize when confronting far-right ideas and arguments is that we need to start with ourselves. In the public debate in Sweden, and I think in Europe in general, we too often see how the far-right narrative is very well articulated. They have a very clear idea of what kind of society they want and how to get there. They also have a very clear definition on like what kind of factors are threatening our societies today and what has to be done about it. And in the like public debate in Sweden, we have seen how politicians tend to get stuck in counter-argument loops rather than presenting an analysis of what kind of society they want, try to encourage people to choose another path. And we have a full workshop on how to define our own narrative that I very briefly will introduce to you today as well. The second principle that I also want to highlight is the importance of analyzing the situation before responding. Sometimes when I give this lecture, I get kind of the impression that the audience is waiting for a silver bullet that they can use in each and every situation. But I will highlight a few questions on how we can analyze the situation in order to choose a path that is best for each and every situation. And sometimes when I give this lecture as well, I have noticed how we tend to focus very much on the person that is expressing the anti-democratic or racist idea. But we tend to forget that a lot of the times there are people around us that can get inspired by hearing another analysis, or people that are more personally affected of what's said. And sometimes we have unrealistic goals that our ambition is to kind of make the person that we meet change opinion at this very specific situation. But what we want to highlight is that we can make so many other kinds of progresses by presenting alternative ways of looking upon the situation or show solidarity with people who are personally affected, for example. Something that I have kind of used a lot historically is using questions as a tool. based on the public debate today, we normally hear arguments that we do not know where they come from. They are marinated in conspiracy theories and alternative facts that is kind of difficult to respond to with arguments and fact-based arguments. But sometimes we can buy ourselves quite some time by just responding with a question. And I will show some examples of that as well. And the fifth and final principle that I want to introduce you to today is how we can avoid responding to emotions with facts. We have developed a method where we ask questions to kind of direct the conversation to a place where we do not respond to people's emotions with facts, because that tend to be very counterproductive, and we tend to push the person away from us rather than kind of presenting an inclusive analysis of the society. But to start off with our own narrative, as I said in the beginning, from what we've seen is that the far right has a very effective way of presenting their own narrative. They have a very clear analysis of why our society sometimes feel like they are failing, and they have very exclusive ways of responding to this. The narrative of the far right sometimes circulates around three main themes. In the far right milieu, they are very explicit of what is the elements that cause a sense of community in our societies. In the far right narrative, we tend to hear stories about, for a society to stick together, we need to be ethnically and culturally homogenic. We need to have some kind of a national cultural elements to kind of bring us all together. And they are also very specific on what elements and what kind of threats that like pushes our society into pieces. And in the Swedish context, we hear a lot of the majority population's needs and rights that needs to be put before minority groups' needs and rights. In the far-right narrative, we also have this very conspiratoric way of describing political or cultural elite in our society that tend to not care about the needs and the wills of the real people. And within this narrative, they also have a very clear vision of what kind of society we together are striving towards. And when we have this workshop, which is also presented in this toolkit, we normally used to let the participants in the workshop discuss these questions, like based on our organization or based on our political party or based on this specific working place that we are giving the lecture at. What are actually the unifying elements in our society for us? Where do we draw the conflict lines? For example, when we meet like the labor movement in Sweden, it's very clear that the conflict lines has nothing to do with like majority versus minority groups. The conflict lines are very clear, has to do with class divisions. And also, of course, this is more difficult to kind of put together in a short period of time, but what is our vision of society? What kind of society are we together striving towards? And just to give you an idea of how this can look, for example, in a civil society organization, when we have this workshop, of course, a sense of community is not created exclusively by sharing a certain Swedish national culture. No, community is created through equal opportunities. We create a sense of community by securing respect and solidarity. I believe in the Swedish case, that's what has been building the Swedish society so strong, that we have historically been a country that is open and curious towards people coming to our country. We have seen cultural differences as a strength, something that brings us together as long as we offer equal opportunities. And when it comes to conflict lines, of course, this has not to do with conflict lines between different groups of people in our society. It has to do with inequalities. Conflict lines are drawn through discrimination and class divisions. This is what kind of brings our society into different pieces and causes this sense of insecurity in our societies. And of course, the vision looks completely different as well. We want to have a democratic and equal society and working life where everyone's equal value and right is given. And this can, of course, at a first glance, look very like fluffy. So I will just give you an example of how we can use our own narrative as a response when we are confronted with far-right ideas. And just to give you an example, I have used a quote from a politician in Sweden. He's called Richard Jomshof. He is a member of the Swedish far-right party, the Swedish Democrats, and until very recently, he was the chairman of the Justice Committee in Sweden. And he said that the multicultural society has failed. We need to break down the multicultural society to create a narrative of the majority population. To do that, we must severely limit immigration to Sweden. And this is an idea, I mean, this is expressed by him in this specific case, but this is ideas that tend to circulate in our daily lives as well, that the society has failed, it has to do with multiculturalism, and we need to create like a sense of community by limiting immigration. So he's very clear in pointing out the conflict line, like the multicultural society is what's causing the same sense of failure in our societies, and what can we do about it? Here, if we have done our own lessons, if we know our own like analysis of where the conflict lines are drawn, we can kind of easily respond to this expression by saying, I agree with the sense that our society has failed in a lot of ways, but in my point of view, it has nothing to do with multiculturalism. In fact, I believe that the failures of our society today has to do with inequalities. We have schools in Sweden that offer completely different sense of belonging and completely different paths for the future for our young kids today, for example. We can continue with the same quote and see that, well, he's also very explicit in his way of creating a sense of community in our society. We need to create a narrative of the majority population. To do that, we must severely limit immigration to Sweden. If I've done my homework, if I know my own narrative, I can kind of easily respond and say that, you know what, I agree that I think it's important that we have a sense of community, that we have like a common narrative in our society. But I believe that that sense of community and that common narrative is based on completely other factors than just limit the immigration to Sweden. I believe that we create a sense of community in our societies by securing that everyone has the same opportunity to participate in our society, to make sure that we do respect basic human rights and show solidarity with people. That's the kind of Sweden that I know, and that's the kind of Sweden that I know that we need to defend in order to continue to be an inclusive and strong country. That was a super brief introduction of the workshop that normally takes at least 45 minutes, so please bear with me. Our other key principle, or the second one, is that we need to analyze the situation before responding. Sometimes we get kind of the sense that we only have 1 or 2 seconds to react before the situation has kind of passed. Therefore, we highlight a number of questions that we believe is important to think about before. For example, the situation is highly affected by the person you meet, where you are, who else is there, and what your specific goal with the situation is. Maybe your goal in this situation is just to kind of end the conversation because we have passed all barriers of what's okay to say. And then one goal itself can be like just to, in a respectful way, say that this is where I draw the line. Or one goal can be to show solidarity with someone who is around you, rather than kind of sticking to this goal of convincing the person that you meet. And this kind of hangs together with the principle of acknowledge the people around you. And to highlight this, we put together a model that I will just briefly go through with you, where we tend to see that people get very focused on the person that can be described as closed or locked into racist or conspiracy theories, ideas, and so on, and focus all their energy on them. And I believe in the vast majority of the cases where I have found myself, it's not possible to reach them with counter narratives or questions or counter arguments. But within this group of people, if you're in a working place or if you're in a political debate, you might have an audience with people that are more ambivalent, people that have not kind of completely fallen into this anti-democratic way of looking upon the society. And they need to hear alternatives. They cannot be left with just counter arguments. They need to hear your version of the story. You can also find in this group of people that actually are open and share your democratic analysis of the society, but for different reasons, they lack the strength or capacity to speak out. By presenting clear, democratic, alternative narratives, you can kind of inspire and strengthen and support them in taking the step next time. And this blue category, which here is called minority groups or vulnerable groups, is something that struck me so many times when I'm out giving this lecture in unions or in companies where they say like, well, Klara, we have this kind of problematic attitudes when it comes to homophobic ideas, for example. But it's not really a problem because we do not have any gay people at this specific group. So we don't really work on that. And of course, that's in the first place a very weird thing to say, but at the same time, you never know that. I actually visited a school a couple of years ago here in Sweden, where I asked the teacher about neo-Nazis ideas in the school, because the school was located in a municipality in Sweden where we have a very strong presence in this municipality of a neo-Nazi organization in Sweden. And she said that, well, Klara, I'm so grateful at this school. We are kind of, we do not have ideas, students expressing these ideas. We have this kind of humoristic way of making anti-Semitic jokes, but I believe it's more a question of these young people not being mature enough to know what it's all about. And I've felt already that this is a weird way of looking upon it, but I gave a lecture in a big room in this school with around 150 people. And when I returned home after this lecture, I received an email on my phone from a boy who were a student at this school. And he said that his parents are Jewish, they live a Jewish life, but in school he was never open about this, because to him, those anti-Semitic like jokes that the teacher looked upon as a question of immaturity was something that really limited his way of life in school. So that's why we have this group as well, to always keep in mind that there might be people in this room who are personally affected of the things that are said, even though if you yourself do not judge it to be as problematic as someone else might do. Our fourth principle is using questions as a tool. Sometimes we get stuck in an idea that we have to respond with very specific fact-based arguments. Myself, I tend to have a number of questions with me that I tend to use. That is a very good way in kind of buying myself some time to see, is this a conversation that has crossed all lines of decency, or can I continue this conversation? For example, if it's just me and the person that's expressing these ideas, then of course I could continue by asking questions. But if it's people around me, I need to take that into account and make the judgment if we have passed all limits of decency. But there are several advantages with using questions. To ask a questions, you make sure that you understood what the person actually said, to make sure that there are no misunderstandings. I found myself in several different situations where I kind of make an excuse to myself, thinking, no, I just misunderstood. He or she didn't mean it in that way, or didn't say it the way I thought it was said, and the situation is kind of unhandled. But by asking curious questions, you get all the facts on the table and you know how to continue the conversation. And of course, to gain some time and get an overview of your different options in that situation. And this one, that to show by asking a question to show that you care and are curious is one point here that sometimes causes reaction when I give these lectures. I was in another small municipality in Sweden that's called Ludvika in the north of Sweden. That's historically been a very strong base for neo-Nazi organizations in Sweden. There I met the young boy who came up to me after the lecture, and he said that, Klara, when I was a teenager, I started to become very curious about these organizations, and I started to read their newspaper, and I went to a couple of meetings. And I had a very wise teacher at this time, and she noticed my interest in those anti-democratic organizations. So one day in school, she kind of took me aside, and she asked me very curiously, like, hey, I've noticed that you start talking so much about Swedish culture and Swedish traditions, and that this is under threat from people coming to Sweden. I just don't really get how that works. Could you please explain to me how you mean? And when this boy, like in this safe space with a person that he felt trust to, got to kind of explain how he meant or how he looked upon it, he realized that I don't really get this puzzle to fit. And I met him several years later when he said that that was kind of a turning point for me, when someone finally listened and I got to explain myself. Then I kind of started to realize that I didn't really had it all together. And finally, when you ask a question, you also kind of force the person in front of you to take responsibility of what was just said. Especially when I'm out visiting schools, I hear stories of young people using humor and jokes and sarcasm as a way of pushing the limits for anti-democratic ideas. And this seemed to be something that's quite difficult to break through for a lot of people. But by asking a question, that could be a way of breaking through this kind of filter of sarcasm. That could be something to at least try out. The fifth and final principle, that is maybe the most complex one that I would like to introduce you to, is, oh, I'm sorry, I just wanted to show you this quote as well. We have a scholar in Sweden called Christer Mattsson who spent decades on talking to young people who kind of initiated their path into anti-democratic organizations. And he uses this method a lot. And he wrote several books, but one of them is called No One Becomes a Neo-Nazi Overnight. And then he interviewed this young boy who said this, that I heard what I was actually saying when you let me finish my thoughts. So that's one example of using questions to make the person kind of realize their way of looking upon things by themselves. So the change came from within in another way. So this final principle of avoiding to respond to emotion with facts, this is a workshop in itself, but it kind of came, the idea came from a meeting that I had in a school several years ago. I heard this young boy who told his teacher that I do not recognize my own neighborhood anymore. I don't go out at night because of this feeling of insecurity. And this teacher knew this boy very well. She knew that if I kind of open up this box now, he will express a lot of anti-democratic and racist ideas about the changes in the society that she felt that she didn't have the capacity or time or whatever to handle at that point. So she was very quick in responding, and she responded like this: well, according to crime statistics, you have nothing to worry about in the neighborhood that you live in. And this didn't turn out very well. This boy obviously had the feeling that his emotions and fears and feelings were not acknowledged at all. And she kind of tried to put a lid on by just responding with facts. And this is problematic in several ways, because when people do communicate with each other, we tend to do that on different levels. We can talk about things that happen in our direct surroundings, in our neighborhood, in our families. We can talk on a level of how this makes us feel or behave. We can also talk about a level of knowledge or facts. things that we have read or heard about. But we can also talk about on a higher level of our core values and core principles and visions of what kind of society we want. And as you saw, this was a situation where they were on completely different levels and didn't reach each other at all. And I'm just playing with the idea that his expression of like fear and anxiety of a society that is changing would have been met with a curious question, like, how do you know that it is so dangerous that you can't go out at night? They would have ended up on the same level and would have been able to continue the discussion from there. And based on this experience, we have developed a workshop of how to use questions as a tool to kind of lead the conversation to another place. And this is the final thing I want to go through with you today on how to use questions to kind of take control over conversations and lead it into a more democratic narrative. This example is taken from a school that I visited 1.5 years ago. Kind of similarly, this girl came up to me after my lecture, and it was just her and me, no one else was around us, so there were no audience listening. It was just the two of us. And she expressed kind of similarly that, Klara, the neighborhood that I live in is very unsafe here. It was a small city and a city that had received a lot of immigrants during 2015, 2016. And I kind of knew where this was headed, but I didn't live in the city. I don't know anything about her neighborhood or anything. So what I felt that I could do was just to ask a curious question, like, how does that make you feel? Or what happens to you when your neighborhood is unsafe? And then she responded kind of similarly, like this other example, that, well, previously I used to hang out with my friends in the city center at night, but now I don't go out at night anymore. I tend to stay at home. And this has to do with her own behavior, her feelings. It's nothing that I can kind of argue against, but I can continue with a curious question like, but how do you know that it is so dangerous that you cannot go out at night anymore? And here I did open up this box, and she presented a lot of very ideas full of prejudices against immigrant groups from different countries, but it all kind of narrowed down to a very strong idea that no, but immigrants are criminals. And we had so many immigrants coming to our neighborhoods and to our municipality. So it makes me super scared and anxious, and I do not go out at night anymore. And I think a lot of us feel this itch now that we want to kind of argue against this, that no, not all immigrants are criminals and this is racist and so on. But since it was just like the two of us and I didn't need to take an audience into account, I just continued to asking questions. So I said, what do you think needs to be done? Like based on the situation that you explained, what do you think needs to be done? And then she had a very radical idea. She said that no matter what kind of crime you commit, if you shoplift or if you drive too fast, if you have heritage from another country, all crime should lead to deportation right away. And as you can see, now we are in a level of talking about values. And if I've done my homework, if I know my own narrative and my own analysis, I could kind of easily respond here, saying like, no, but I believe in a society where like how we judge a crime is not something that is judged based upon where the person comes from. It's based upon the character of the crime and nothing else. But since it was just her and me, I continued actually to ask a question. Okay, based on this situation that seems very problematic for you, that you do not go out anymore, and I'm so sorry that you feel this strong fear, how would you like it to be? And then she kind of gave me a very easy way out. She said that, well, I just want to save society. And as you can see, now we are talking about her vision of what kind of society that she wants. And if I've done my homework, if I know my analysis of the society, if I know my own idea of what kind of society I want and how to get there, I can kind of easily respond here on this level. well, you know what, that's what I want too. But I think to get a safer society, we need to work on inequalities. We need to make sure that kids go to school that offer the same kind of opportunities, that we combat racism and discrimination in our society to once and for all make people feel as they do belong in the society, not cause division by judging crimes based on the person's origin, for example, but on the character of the crime. So I know that this might look like some kind of board game at first glance, but the point we want to make here is trying not to respond to people's feelings or expressions of their direct surroundings, and sometimes not even respond to people's arguments based on facts, because in many times we do not really know where those facts and statistics come from, and then it's easier to kind of just direct the conversation to a spot where we get to talk about vision and values instead, because I think that's where we can make a huge change in presenting alternatives. Because when we're stuck at the level of discussing facts, we just tend to present different versions of facts and we do not come anywhere. In the worst case scenario, the person is leaving the conversation even more convinced that their facts are correct and our facts are just ignorant and naive or whatever. So the point of asking questions rather than responding with counter arguments is to transfer the dialogue to a position or a place where we can present our own narrative in another way. And in the same way as I used to have backup questions, I used to have some backup sayings like, I don't believe it's that simple, or the way that I see it is that the best way to create a sense of national identity is to respect and be curious about our different backgrounds. I do believe that we have more in common than we do tend to think. So all those principles that I've presented are summarized in this toolkit, and they can be developed in different ways. And if you would like to kind of continue this within your own organization, I would recommend you to start with your own narrative. And we actually did this at the Expo Foundation just a year ago. And I think that we were completely certain about our own narrative as an organization. But when we dived a bit deeper into those questions, but for us as an organization, what is it that kind of creates a sense of community in our society? It wasn't crystal clear. Of course, we're different individuals, but I think it's important as an organization to have a clear response and have a clear response to the challenges of our society, because all different countries that are represented in this meeting today do have challenges, of course. But if we just ignore those challenges and kind of argue against them, we won't win any support or voters, or depending on what kind of organization we are, of course.